A loyal knight of William the Conqueror vanishes during the brutal subjugation of England, his fate a footnote in the bloody ledger of the Norman conquest. 10 years later, his sword is found pristine and deliberately buried, transforming a cold case of a fallen soldier into a terrifying conspiracy. The perfectly preserved blade was not a trophy of war, but a warning, its discovery threatening to expose a secret that could bring the conqueror's new kingdom to its knees. The summons arrived with the evening rain, a sodden parchment delivered by a panicked messenger who smelled of wet wool and fear. Brother Thomas, his fingers stained with the iron gall ink he used to chronicle the lives of saints, recognized the seal of the local Norman prefect, a crude stamp of a wolf's head that promised only worldly troubles. The message was terse, demanding his presence in the village of Thornwick at once, a place known for little more than its sullen Saxon peasants and the cloying mud that clung to its paths. Thomas felt the familiar pull of a life he had forsaken, the dangerous currents of Norman politics that still swirled beyond the monastery's stone walls. Even here in the sullen heart of Yorkshire, in the year of our Lord 1076, the abbot had granted him leave with a pursed-lipped reluctance, his eyes conveying a warning that some stones, once turned, reveal only serpents. He rode through a landscape still bearing the scars of the conqueror's northern harrowing, a decade-old wound that refused to heal. The skeletal remains of burned-out crofts clawed at the grey sky, grim monuments to a peace enforced by sword and fire. The air itself seemed heavy with resentment, a silence in the fields that felt louder than any spoken threat. Brother Thomas clutched the simple wooden cross that hung from his belt, its familiar shape, a small comfort against the encroaching chill of both the evening and his own disquiet. His destination was a meager plot of land belonging to a peasant named Godwin, a man whose desperation had apparently led him to unearth a problem that the local garrison could not solve, or perhaps did not wish to. The prefect's brief note had spoken of a discovery in a well, a description that did little to explain the palpable sense of dread that had accompanied the messenger. Godwin was a man hollowed out by hunger, his face a roadmap of hardship, and his hands calloused from a lifetime of futile labor. He stood beside a freshly dug pit, its mound of dark, damp earth, a stark wound in the green of his failing pasture. Norman soldiers, their chainmail coifs dripping with rain, formed a loose, contemptuous circle around the hole, their expressions a mixture of boredom and irritation. They leaned on their spears, their presence a constant reminder of who now ruled this damp and defiant corner of England. Godwin flinched as Thomas approached, his eyes darting from the monk to the grim-faced captain of the guard, a man whose stony silence seemed more menacing than any shouted order. The captain, a thick-necked Breton named Henry, gestured impatiently toward the hole with a gauntleted hand. He was digging for water, his old well having run dry. Henry grunted, his northern French accent grating on the damp air. Found this instead. At the bottom of the shallow pit, nestled on the wet clay, lay a long dark shape, wrapped carefully in what looked like oilcloth. A section of the covering had been pulled back, revealing the intricate, wire-wrapped grip and heavy, rounded pommel of a knight's sword. It was an instrument of authority and death, utterly out of place in this humble peasant's field, and its presence hummed with a dangerous energy. Brother Thomas knelt, the wet grass soaking the hem of his woolen habit, and peered into the pit. The prefect had sent for him not for his faith, but for his memory, for the knowledge he possessed from his former life as a scribe in the Conqueror's court. Before he had taken his vows, his world had been one of seals and signatures, of recognizing the crests and armaments of the very men who had carved this kingdom from its Saxon predecessor. The sword was unmistakably Norman, its make and balance a world away from the heavier axes favored by the vanquished English. The pommel was wrought in a distinctive trilobate fashion, a style favored by the highest echelons of the invading nobility. With the captain's grudging permission, Thomas carefully lifted the weapon from its resting place. The weight of it was immense, a warrior's tool, yet it felt balanced and alive in his hands. He unwrapped the rest of the oilcloth, his movements slow and deliberate, revealing a long, double-edged blade of gleaming, unblemished steel. There were no nicks from desperate parrying, no rust spots from years of neglect in the damp earth, no bloodstains in the fuller. This sword had not been lost in the chaos of battle or discarded after a skirmish. it had been preserved. It belonged to Sir Aldric de Montclair, Thomas stated, his voice quiet but firm, cutting through the murmurs of the soldiers. He ran a careful finger over the crossguard, where a small, inlaid silver falcon, the de Montclair family crest, was clearly visible. A ripple of recognition went through the older soldiers, men who had served in the initial years of the occupation. Sir Aldric had been a name spoken with respect and a little fear, a knight known for his unwavering loyalty to William and his brutal efficiency in carrying out the Conqueror's will. His disappearance 10 years prior, in 1066, had been a minor mystery at the time, a brief note in the campaign chronicles. He had been leading a small patrol, sweeping for the Saxon rebels that still haunted the northern forests like vengeful ghosts. When neither he nor his men returned, the official account was swift and certain. They had been ambushed, their bodies lost to the wild terrain, or dragged away by wolves. It was a common enough story in those violent days, a plausible end for a Norman knight deep in hostile territory. But the condition of this sword told a different story. Thomas examined the pit more closely, his eyes tracing the careful placement of the stones that Godwin's spade had first struck. They had not been tumbled in by chance or erosion. They had been deliberately laid, a protective cairn to shield the blade from the crushing weight of the earth above. This was not a burial of haste or contempt. It was a cache, a secret hidden with purpose and care. Godwin, Thomas said, turning to the terrified peasant, his voice gentle. Were there other stones? The peasant nodded vigorously, pointing a trembling finger to a small, neat pile a few feet away. They were flat, river-smoothed stones, unlike the jagged rocks that littered the rest of the field. Someone had gone to great effort to select them, to build this strange subterranean vault for a weapon that should have been at its owner's side in his final moments. The carefully arranged stones and the pristine condition of the blade screamed a truth that contradicted the decade-old official narrative. Sir Aldric de Montclair had not fallen to Saxon rebels. His vanishing was something else entirely. As Thomas stood there, the cold weight of the sword in his hands, he understood that the peasant had not just unearthed a knight's weapon, he had unearthed a lie. Brother Thomas began his inquiry with the men of the Thornwick garrison, questioning the handful of veterans who had served in the region since the conquest. Their recollections of the days surrounding Sir Aldric's disappearance were delivered with a monotonous similarity, a chorus of rehearsed facts that offered no new insight. They all recalled the patrol, the grim weather, and the general assumption of a Saxon ambush, their stories fitting together with the neat, artificial precision of a Roman mosaic. It felt less like memory and more like a recitation, a story told so many times that it had replaced the truth entirely. The Captain Henri watched the proceedings with a hawk's eye, his presence ensuring that none of his men strayed from the accepted history. The true work began only when Thomas dismissed the soldiers and turned his attention back to the silent, terrified Godwin. He led the peasant away from the well and the prying ears of the garrison toward the meager shade of a gnarled hawthorn tree at the edge of the field. There, speaking in the soft Anglian dialect of Godwin's youth, rather than the harsh Norman French of the court, Thomas learned the truth of the discovery. The well site had not been chosen for its promise of water, for Godwin's own divining rod had suggested a more promising spot closer to his cottage. He had dug in this specific place because of a story, a deathbed whisper from his grandfather years ago. The old man, his mind clouded by age and milk fever, had spoken of a great oak that once stood on this very spot, an ancient tree felled by the Normans in their fury, and of a treasure buried beneath its roots to keep it from their rapacious hands. The story had been of Norman gold, a tempting legend in a land bled dry by its new masters. Godwin, facing another failed harvest, and the hungry mouths of his children, had clung to this desperate half-remembered tale. He had dug not for water, but for a miracle, and had found a knight's sword instead. This revelation shifted the foundation of the mystery entirely. The sword had not been hidden in some random patch of Yorkshire mud. It had been deliberately placed at a known, albeit forgotten, landmark. The great oak was long gone, but the memory of it, passed down through a generation, had endured, a secret map waiting for a desperate man to follow its instructions. Later that night, within the cold, comforting stone walls of the monastery's scriptorium, Thomas examined the sword again, away from the suspicious glares of the soldiers, the object seemed to speak more clearly. The candlelight danced along the polished fuller, a weapon that had seen no violence. The true discovery, however, came not from the blade, but from the hilt. The leather grip, hardened by time, was wrapped tightly with silver wire, but as Thomas turned it over and over in his hands, his sensitive fingertips detected a faint, unnatural impression in the hardened material, just below the crossguard. It was a circular indentation, a ghost of an image pressed into the leather. Using a fine stylus and a magnifying lens crafted by the monastery's glassblower, he carefully traced the faint lines. It was the imprint of a seal ring, the kind used to press a man's authority into warm wax. It was not, however, the falcon crest of the de Montclair family. This was something different, a complex signet bearing the image of a crowned serpent, a symbol he vaguely recalled from his days as a royal scribe, but could not immediately place. Sir Aldrich had evidently held something sealed with this ring, clutching it with such force or for such a duration, that its image had become permanently embossed upon the leather of his sword's grip. The sword was not just a weapon, it was a message, a signpost pointing toward another hidden power. His heart quickening, Thomas turned his attention to the pommel. It was a heavy three-lobed piece of solid steel, designed to perfectly counterbalance the long blade. He noticed a faint line, almost invisible to the naked eye, suggesting it was not one solid piece but two, expertly fitted together. Using the fine tip of a knife, he carefully worked at the seam, probing for a mechanism or release. After a tense, breathless minute, a section of the pommel gave way with a soft click. It was a small, hollow compartment, a secret chamber no larger than his thumb, designed to be utterly overlooked. Inside, nestled in a scrap of lamb's wool, was a tiny, tightly rolled scroll of vellum, no bigger than a child's finger. Its presence confirmed his growing suspicion that the sword was a vessel, a container for a truth too dangerous to be written in any official record. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled the fragile parchment. The script was tiny, cramped, and written in a faded brown ink. It was not the bold, confident hand of Sir Aldrich de Montclair, which Thomas had seen on past military dispatches. This was a different hand, more elegant and precise, the writing of a scholar or a high-born lady. The message was maddeningly incomplete, its edges crumbled away by time and dampness. Only a few phrases remained legible, islands of text in a sea of decay, yet the words that survived were explosive. Thomas read them over and over, the silence of the scriptorium pressing in on him. The bastard's true heir is not, followed by a gap, and then protect the Saxon princess who must never speak, and a final chilling fragment at the bottom. The oath is broken, the crown is stained. The words were a thunderclap in the quiet room. They spoke not of Saxon rebels, or a lost patrol, but of a dynastic secret, a hidden heir, and a Saxon princess. The sword of Sir Aldrich de Montclair, the loyal and brutal servant of William the Conqueror, had been buried with a message that branded his master a usurper. The loyal knight's last act, it seemed, was one of treason. The fragmentary message from the pommel sent Brother Thomas deep into the monastery's archives, a labyrinth of parchment and memory that held the chronicles of a conquered kingdom. The words "the bastard's true heir" were a clear and treasonous reference to King William, whose illegitimate birth was a well-known, if unspoken, vulnerability. For 10 years, Norman power had been consolidated through bloodshed and the careful construction of a legal right to rule, a right that Thomas now knew was built upon a hidden, fragile foundation. His search was no longer for a knight's murderer, but for the identity of the mysterious Saxon princess and the nature of the claim that Sir Aldrich had died to conceal. His past life as a royal scribe gave him a unique advantage, a familiarity with the noble genealogies and political marriages that formed the true language of power. He knew that the greatest threats to a king rarely came from a battlefield, but from a baptismal record or a marriage contract. He spent days poring over dusty charters and land grants from the years preceding the invasion of 1066. He cross-referenced Norman military rosters with Saxon family lineages, searching for any link, any connection that the court historians had overlooked or deliberately erased. The crowned serpent signet, whose impression was seared into the sword's grip, remained a frustrating enigma, a symbol of a power that had operated in the shadows. Finally, In a collection of ecclesiastical letters from the old Northumbrian diocese, he found his first tangible lead. A letter from a parish priest complained to his bishop about the unusual activities of Sir Aldrich de Montclair in the summer before his disappearance. The knight was not conducting routine patrols, as the official record stated. He was making quiet, discreet inquiries about the former Saxon Earl of Northumbria and his family, who were believed to have fled north into Scotland after the Battle of Hastings. The letter mentioned that Sir Aldrich seemed particularly interested in the Earl's youngest daughter, the Lady Edith of Wessex, and any potential betrothal contracts she may have had. Following this thread, Thomas cross-referenced the de Montclair name with land seizures in the region. He discovered that after Sir Aldrich's officially recognized death, a vast estate belonging to a lesser Saxon the Den named Edwig, known to be a sworn man to Edith's family, had been confiscated and granted to a Norman lord. The official reason was Edwig's supposed participation in a local uprising, but the timing, just weeks after Aldrich's disappearance, felt too convenient. The estate, known as Blackwood Manor, was now listed as abandoned and falling into ruin, its new Norman owner preferring to live closer to the safety of the garrisoned city of York. Sensing he could learn no more from the brittle pages of the past, Thomas procured a horse and set out for the site of the abandoned manor. He found it in a secluded valley, miles from any main road, a place slowly being reclaimed by the wilderness. The great hall stood as a skeletal ruin, its thatched roof long since collapsed, leaving its timber frame exposed to the elements like the ribs of a great beast. The air of deliberate destruction was unmistakable. This was not the slow decay of neglect, but the result of a targeted, violent purge. Someone had wanted this place, and its memories wiped from the face of the earth. Thomas walked through the ghostly remains, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. He was searching for something that had survived the destruction, a piece of the puzzle that the purgers had missed. His search led him to the manor's small, detached chapel, a stone structure that had better withstood the ravages of time. Inside, the air was cold and musty, smelling of damp stone and decay. The small altar had been overturned, and the baptismal font smashed, yet another sign of violent desecration. As he ran his hands along the cold stone walls, searching for anything unusual, his fingers brushed against a section of plaster that felt different, hollow beneath the surface. Using the hilt of his eating knife, he chipped away at the crumbling plaster, revealing the faint outline of wooden planks beneath. It was a false wall, constructed with skill to be almost unnoticeable. With considerable effort, he pried the boards loose, revealing a dark, cramped space behind the altar. The recess was an arm's length deep, and within it, wrapped in oilcloth, just as the sword had been, was a heavy leather-bound satchel. His heart pounded in his chest as he pulled it into the dim light of the chapel. Inside was not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable and far more dangerous, a cache of documents, preserved from the damp by the careful wrapping. They were written in a mix of Latin and Old English, and their contents were staggering. There was a formal marriage contract, signed and sealed, between Lady Edith of Wessex and a high-ranking Norman lord. Thomas stared at the groom's name, his blood running cold. It was not some minor nobleman, but a powerful baron, with close ties to William's inner circle, a man who had stood with the Conqueror at Hastings. Beneath the contract were other documents, each one adding another layer to the conspiracy. There were baptismal records for a male child, born of this union a year before the invasion, his birth witnessed and attested to by the local priest. There was personal correspondence between Edith and her husband, letters filled with both affection and a growing sense of fear, speaking of the shifting political winds and the danger their union posed. The final document was a letter from Sir Aldrich de Montclair himself, addressed to Lady Edith. It confirmed that he had been sent to find her and her son, and to eliminate them and any proof of their existence. But the letter made it devastatingly clear that the knight, tormented by the monstrous task he had been given, had chosen to defy his orders. He had discovered proof of a legitimate, half-Saxon, half-Norman heir to the English throne, and rather than destroy it, he had chosen to protect it. The ruins of Blackwood Manor were not the site of his failure, but the evidence of his treasonous success. The documents from the hidden cache in the ruined chapel laid the conspiracy bare with chilling clarity. Brother Thomas sat in the faint candlelight of a small inn miles from Thornwick, the parchments spread before him, like a royal death sentence. The Saxon princess from the sword's pommel was Lady Edith of Wessex, a woman from a powerful Saxon lineage, and her secret marriage to a Norman baron before the conquest was not a simple romance, but a calculated political gambit. The union, Thomas surmised, was likely orchestrated by factions on both sides, hoping to create a bridge between Saxon and Norman, a candidate for the throne who could unite the two peoples and avert the very bloodshed that William's invasion had unleashed. This child, born of both worlds, would have possessed a claim to the English throne that was arguably stronger and more legitimate in the eyes of the English people than William's own, which rested solely on conquest and a disputed promise from a dead king. Sir Aldric de Montclair's true mission now became horrifyingly clear. He had not been hunting for scattered rebels in the Yorkshire forests. He had been dispatched on the most sensitive of errands to act as an assassin for the crown, to erase a bloodline that posed a direct threat to William's legitimacy. The official patrol was merely a cover story, a means to move through the countryside without suspicion. His task was to find Lady Edith and her young son, who had evidently gone into hiding at Blackwood Manor under the protection of the loyal Verding Edwig, and to extinguish their lives and burn any document that proved their existence. The ruined manor was not just an abandoned estate, it was the intended site of a political murder, a place where a legitimate heir to the throne was meant to die, his claims silenced forever. But the evidence before Thomas proved that Sir Aldric had recoiled from his bloody task. The knight's own letter to Lady Edith was a confession of his tormented conscience, the words of a man caught between his feudal oath to his king and the laws of God. He wrote of the child's innocence and the injustice of his orders, stating his intention to defy the will of his master. He had not betrayed his king for gold or power, but for honor. Instead of carrying out the assassination, Sir Aldric had orchestrated a desperate escape. He had chosen to protect the very family he was sent to destroy, a decision that sealed his own fate. The knight's disappearance, Thomas now understood, was inextricably linked to the family's vanishing act. They had all disappeared at the same time, because they had disappeared together. This was the second major twist in the path of his investigation. Sir Aldric was not a victim of a conspiracy, but its primary architect. His disappearance was not a murder he had stumbled upon, but the price of his own heroic treason. He had successfully spirited away a woman and child, with a dynastic claim that could shatter the Norman kingdom. The sword, then, was not merely a marker for his own grave. It was a signal, a prearranged message. Its deliberate placement under the old oak, its pristine condition, and the hidden scroll were all part of a complex plan. It was perhaps a sign to allies that the first part of his mission, the family's escape, was complete, but that he himself would not be following. He had stayed behind to ensure their flight was successful, likely leading his pursuers on a false trail, before finally being cornered and killed by the very men he served. The realization settled upon Thomas with the weight of a burial shroud. Sir Aldric de Montclair, the fearsome Norman enforcer, had died a martyr's death, protecting a Saxon heir from a Norman king. The official narrative of his death at the hands of Saxon rebels was more than just a convenient lie. It was a masterful piece of propaganda. It simultaneously removed a disloyal knight, explained his absence, and further blackened the name of the Saxon resistance, all while concealing the terrifying truth of a rival claimant to the throne. The men who had ordered the original assassination must have been the same men who discovered Aldric's betrayal and subsequently murdered him, burying his sword according to his own plan, but for their own reasons, perhaps as a grim, undiscovered monument to their secret. The crowned serpent seal remained the key. It was not Sir Aldric's seal, nor was it William's. It had to be the symbol of the Norman baron who had fathered the child, the secret husband of Lady Edith. This man, a powerful figure in William's court, was playing the most dangerous game imaginable. He had woven a web of intrigue that could either place his son on the throne or see his entire lineage erased for treason. Sir Aldric had become an unwilling pawn in this game and had ultimately sacrificed himself to it. The knight's carefully preserved sword, with its hidden message and its symbolic placement, was his final move from beyond the grave, a testament to his choice. Thomas carefully gathered the documents, his mind reeling from the implications. The investigation had begun with a simple 10-year-old mystery of a missing knight. It had now spiraled into a vast conspiracy involving a secret royal marriage, a hidden heir to the throne of England, and the noble sacrifice of a man torn between duty and conscience. The sword was a key, but it had unlocked a door to a room filled with secrets that powerful men had already killed to protect. And now, he was the only living person, as far as he knew, who held that key. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than any crown, and the path forward was shrouded in shadow, with enemies lurking where he could not see them, their power built on the very lie he had just uncovered. He knew with a chilling certainty that the men who had murdered Sir Aldrich would not hesitate to silence a meddlesome monk. The letters found in the ruined chapel provided Brother Thomas with his next tenuous lead. In her correspondence, Lady Edith mentioned arranging passage to a safe haven through a trusted intermediary, a merchant who traded in Irish wool and French wine, a man whose ships and loyalties were for sale. His name was Tostig, a man of Saxon birth, who had nonetheless prospered under Norman rule, by making himself useful to both sides. The letters suggested Tostig operated out of the bustling port of Ravenspur, a chaotic hub of commerce and intrigue on the Humber estuary. It was a place where secrets could be bought and sold as easily as barrels of wine, and where a man could disappear without a trace if he had the coin. Thomas knew that finding this merchant was a gamble. A decade had passed, and the man could be long dead or simply vanished. But Tostig was the only link he had to the fate of Lady Edith and her son, after they fled Blackwood Manor. Travelling as a simple mendicant friar, Thomas made his way to the teeming, salt-caked port of Ravenspur. The harbour was a forest of masts, a cacophony of shouting sailors, creaking ropes, and the clang of merchant scales. Here the raw power of Norman England was on full display, not in garrisons and castles, but in the flow of taxed goods and the deference paid to the Norman French spoken by customs officials. After several days of cautious inquiries in the dockside taverns, playing the part of a humble monk researching trade histories, he finally found his man. Tostig was older now, his prosperity visible in the fine wool of his tunic and the silver rings on his weathered hands, but his eyes were still sharp and wary, the eyes of a man who had survived by navigating the treacherous currents of other people's wars. Thomas found him overseeing the loading of a cog bound for Dublin, and approached him with a carefully constructed story. He claimed to be executing the final will of a deceased nobleman, seeking to deliver a small inheritance to a woman named Edith, who had travelled to Ireland approximately 10 years ago. He mentioned Sir Aldrich de Montclair's name, describing him as the woman's sworn protector, and watched the merchant's face for any flicker of recognition. For a moment, Tostig's affable mask slipped, his eyes narrowed, and the pleasantries died on his lips. He denied any knowledge, claiming the name meant nothing to him, but his denial was too quick, too sharp. Thomas knew he was lying. That evening, Thomas followed Tostig from the docks to a secluded storehouse pungent with the smell of dried fish and tar. He confronted the merchant again, this time abandoning his pretense. He spoke quietly of the ruined chapel at Blackwood Manor, of the hidden cache of documents, and of a sword found in a peasant's well. He did not reveal the full scope of the conspiracy, but he revealed enough to make Tostig understand that the secret he had kept for a decade was no longer safe. The merchant's face paled in the flickering lamplight of his warehouse. He stared at the monk as if he were a ghost, a spectre from a past he had taken great pains to bury. Cornered and afraid, Tostig finally broke his silence, his voice a low, urgent whisper. He confessed that he remembered Sir Aldrich de Montclair well. The knight had approached him months before his famed disappearance, a man visibly tormented and desperate. He had sought secret swift passage to Ireland for a high-born lady and a young boy, offering a small fortune in Norman silver for the merchant's silence and cooperation. Tostig, a man for whom coin had no nationality, had agreed. He described Sir Aldrich not as the confident, brutal commander of Norman legend, but as a broken man, wrestling with a profound crisis of faith and fealty. The knight had spoken in veiled, agonized terms of his orders, calling them a betrayal of God and honor. Tostig recounted Sir Aldrich's final words to him on the night the ship sailed. The knight had stood on the dark, wind-swept quay, watching the small vessel disappear into the blackness of the North Sea. He had handed Tostig the last payment, his hand trembling. "I have served a man who would make a butcher of a knight," Aldrich had whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "There are sins that crown kings and damn knights, merchant. Pray for my soul, for I have chosen damnation to save an innocent. Tostig had never seen him again. The news of his death at the hands of Saxon rebels had spread weeks later, a story the merchant had always known to be a lie, but had been too terrified to ever contradict. This testimony was the crucial link. It confirmed that Sir Aldric's plan had succeeded. Lady Edith and her son, the boy with a claim to the English throne, had escaped England's shores. They had made it to Ireland, disappearing into a new life across the sea, their flight paid for by a knight's silver and sealed by his sacrifice. Tostig's tale painted a vivid portrait of Aldric's final days, a man willingly walking toward his own death to uphold a principle he valued more than his life. He had not died protecting the family in a physical sense, as Thomas had first surmised. He had died creating a diversion, buying them time, ensuring their escape was absolute, before the king's hunters could pick up their trail. His life was the price of their passage. Tostig also provided one final, critical piece of information. He did not know the Norman baron who had fathered the child, but he did know that the silver Sir Aldric had paid him with was unusual. It was not English or Norman coin. It was minted in Flanders, and the pouch it came in bore a small embroidered device, a crowned serpent. The merchant had thought little of it at the time, but for Thomas, it was a revelation. The symbol from the sword grip, the mark of the secret conspirator, was now linked to a specific source of wealth, a tangible clue that pointed away from Normandy and toward the powerful mercantile cities of the Low Countries. The web of this conspiracy was wider and more complex than he had ever imagined. With Tostig's fearful confession, the fate of the fugitives was confirmed, and the character of Sir Aldric was redeemed, but the identity of the true power player, the man with the serpent's seal, remained cloaked in shadow. Armed with the merchant's testimony and the damning knowledge of the escape to Ireland, Brother Thomas returned to the Abbey of St. Hilda at Whitby, the weight of his discovery a near physical burden. The truth was too vast, too perilous for one man to bear alone. He needed guidance, a confidant with the wisdom and authority to understand the catastrophic implications of a rival heir to William's throne. His choice was the man who had been his spiritual father for 20 years, Abbot Michael, a figure of serene piety and scholarly renown, a man Thomas trusted implicitly. He sought out the abbot in his private study, a chamber lined with illuminated manuscripts and filled with the scent of beeswax and old parchment, a sanctuary of peace that was about to be shattered. Thomas laid out the entire story, his voice a low, urgent murmur in the quiet room. He spoke of the sword in the well, the hidden message in the pommel, the ruined chapel and its cache of documents. He recounted the merchant's tale of Sir Aldric's torment and the successful flight of Lady Edith and her son to Ireland. He finished by placing the vellum scroll with its fragmentary treasonous words upon the abbot's oak table. He looked to the old man for guidance, for wisdom, for some way to navigate the moral and political whirlpool that had opened at his feet. He expected shock, perhaps fear, but not the reaction he received. Abbot Michael did not touch the scroll. He stared at it, as if it were a coiled viper. His face, usually a mask of calm contemplation, slowly crumbling into an expression of profound, soul-deep weariness. The color drained from his cheeks, and he aged a decade in a matter of moments. When he finally spoke, his voice was a dry, rasping whisper, utterly devoid of its usual resonance. "You should have left the sword in the earth, my son," he said. His eyes filled not with surprise, but with a terrible, ancient sorrow. Some truths are seeds that once planted grow only into gallows. And then in that quiet, holy room, the abbot confessed his own monstrous sin. He, Abbot Michael, had been one of them. He had been part of the conspiracy, one of the small, powerful circle of Norman lords and clerics who had known of the secret marriage and the threat posed by the half-Saxon heir. He revealed that years ago, before taking his final vows and retreating from the world, he had been a political advisor to the very baron who had married Lady Edith, the man whose seal was the crowned serpent. The marriage had been their gamble, a desperate, idealistic plan to forge a lasting peace by placing a unifying king on the throne, a king who would rule by blood right and consent, not by conquest and terror. But the plan had fractured. King William's intelligence network had learned of the child's existence, and the order had come down not from the king himself, but from his most ruthless lieutenants. Find the boy and his mother, and eliminate them. The conspirators were faced with a terrible choice: expose their plot and face certain execution for treason, or join the cover-up and sacrifice their own gambit to save their lives. They chose survival. It was they who had dispatched Sir Aldric de Montclair, a knight known for his unthinking loyalty, to perform the grim task, believing he would obey without question. They had selected him precisely because they thought he lacked the moral complexity to defy a direct order. This was the third and most sickening twist of all. The very man Thomas had turned to for sanctuary was part of the darkness he sought to expose. The abbot's confession poured out like a torrent, a purge of a decade of guilt. He explained that when they learned of Sir Aldric's betrayal, that he was not hunting the family but helping them, the conspirators had panicked. They could not allow the knight to succeed or to fall into the hands of the king's other agents, for he knew all their names. So they had taken matters into their own hands. It was a faction of his own allies, his own confederates in the original plot, who had intercepted Sir Aldric. The abbot described the final fatal meeting. They had lured the knight to a secluded location, under the pretense of offering further aid for the family's escape. Sir Aldric, believing he was meeting with friends, had walked into a trap. He was murdered not by the king's men, but by his own compatriots, the very people whose secret heir he was trying to save. They killed him to ensure his silence, to sever the last link between themselves and the treasonous plot. The current Earl of Yorkshire, a man of immense power and cruelty, had been there. He had delivered the killing blow himself. The abbot's final revelation was a chilling warning. The burial of the sword had been their work, a grim fulfillment of a plan Aldric had likely shared with them. They had buried it as a marker, a secret memorial to their own damned souls, but also as a warning to each other of the price of failure. Abbot Michael looked at Thomas, his eyes pleading. "They will kill you, Thomas," he whispered. "The Earl of Yorkshire, the others. They have spent 10 years reinforcing the lie. They have murdered to protect it, and they will murder again. Drop this, my son. For the love of God, burn the documents and forget what you have learned. Let the dead remain buried." The sanctuary of the study had become a cage, and the man Thomas revered as a spiritual guide had revealed himself to be a conspirator in the murder of a noble knight, and a keeper of a secret that was now destined to be his own tomb. Abbot Michael's confession had been a plea for survival, a desperate warning to abandon the quest for truth. But for Brother Thomas, it was a call to action. The knowledge that Sir Aldric's murderers were not some shadowy, unknown agents of the king, but a specific cabal of powerful men like his own abbot, and most prominently, the current Earl of Yorkshire, transformed the investigation from a historical inquiry into a present and mortal danger. The abbot had chosen self-preservation, retreating into his holy orders to escape the consequences of his political machinations. Thomas, however, felt bound by the sacrifice of the knight he had never met. To let the lie stand was to become complicit in the abbot's sin, and to dishonor the memory of Sir Aldric. He knew that to proceed was to walk into the serpent's den, but to retreat felt like a betrayal of his own soul. He began a new, far more dangerous line of investigation, focusing on the Earl of Yorkshire. This man, a Norman baron named Guy de Lorraine, had been granted his title and vast lands shortly after the suppression of the northern rebellions. He ruled his domain with an iron fist, a man known for his swift, brutal justice and his unswerving loyalty to King William. Outwardly, he was the very model of a successful Norman conqueror, but Thomas now saw him through the abbot's terrified eyes, a murderer and a conspirator, a man who had personally slain a fellow knight to conceal a decade-old treason. Thomas's objective was to find proof of the Earl's deception, evidence that would corroborate the abbot's story and expose the Earl's role in the long-running cover-up. Working under the guise of compiling a history of the local parishes for the abbey, Thomas gained access to court and church records in York, the seat of the Earl's power. He started by searching for any unusual deaths or disappearances that had occurred in the 10 years since Sir Aldric had vanished. He cross-referenced the names of local priests, scribes, and Saxon nobles who had connections to the old Northumbrian aristocracy or the region around Blackwood Manor. A disturbing pattern began to emerge. A parish priest from a village near the manor, the same one who had likely performed the baptism of the hidden heir, had died suddenly of a fever just a year after Aldrich's disappearance. His successor was a Norman cleric, with close ties to the new earl. Further digging revealed more. A Saxon scribe, a man known to have worked for Lady Edith's father, was found dead in an alley in York 2 years later. His death was ruled the result of a drunken brawl, a common enough tragedy in the rough city. But Thomas found a notation in an old ledger that the scribe had been petitioning the earl for the return of confiscated family lands. Lands that bordered the now ruined Blackwood estate. Another name surfaced, a stonemason who had helped build the chapel at the manor. He had fallen from a scaffold while working on the earl's new castle, another convenient accident that removed a potential witness to the chapel's secret construction. Each discovery was a single fragile thread. Alone, they were merely the sad, unremarkable casualties of a harsh and violent era. But when woven together, they formed the tapestry of a meticulous, decade-long campaign of assassination and suppression. The Earl of Yorkshire, Guy de Laurent, had not simply participated in Sir Aldrich's murder. He had spent the subsequent 10 years systematically eliminating anyone with even the most remote knowledge of Lady Edith, her son, or the events at Blackwood Manor. He had been diligently pruning the tree of knowledge, ensuring that every branch that could possibly lead back to the truth was severed. The deaths were all plausibly explained, spaced out over years, a slow and patient cleansing of the historical record. The Earl's deception was a masterpiece of cold-blooded, long-term strategy. He had used his immense power and the chaotic backdrop of the post-conquest period to hide his crimes in plain sight. He had curated the official history of his own earldom, replacing Saxon clergy with his own men, silencing petitioners, and ensuring that any whisper of the past died in the throats of those who might speak it. Thomas realized with a jolt of ice in his veins that he was now the sole loose end. The peasant Godwin had unearthed the sword, but it was he, Brother Thomas, who had followed the clues and reassembled the story the Earl had worked so hard to obliterate. He was the only person left alive who possessed the whole truth, from the sword in the well to the abbot's confession. This knowledge was a terrifying burden. He was no longer just a monk, uncovering a historical wrong. He was a threat to one of the most powerful and ruthless men in England. The Earl's network of spies and agents would be everywhere. Thomas began to see shadows in every corner, to scrutinize every unfamiliar face in the monastery's halls. The abbey, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The abbot's warning echoed in his mind, no longer as a plea, but as a prophecy. He understood that the Earl, if he got even the slightest hint that the secret was out, would not hesitate to add a meddling monk to his long list of convenient accidents and unfortunate demises. The investigation had reached its most perilous stage. Thomas had found the evidence of the Earl's bloody work, but in doing so, he had placed his own life squarely in the crosshairs of a patient and methodical killer. The Earl's campaign of terror in Yorkshire had sealed off nearly every avenue of investigation in England. To continue his search, there would be suicide. Brother Thomas knew his only hope of finding incontrovertible proof lay across the sea, in the one place the Earl's influence could not so easily reach, Ireland. The merchant Tostig had confirmed that Lady Edith and her son had sailed for its shores, seeking refuge in a land that remained a defiant outpost of Celtic culture, largely beyond the grasp of Norman power. Thomas reasoned that if the fugitives had survived, they would have likely sought sanctuary within the powerful and independent Irish Church, an institution with its own network of monasteries and a long tradition of protecting exiles. He had to find them not only to confirm their survival, but to understand what had become of the boy with a claim to the English throne. Using his credentials as a Benedictine scholar, Thomas wrote letters to several prominent Irish monasteries, including the great scriptoriums at Clonmacnoise and Armagh. He framed his inquiries carefully, claiming to be researching the genealogies of exiled Saxon noble families who had fled England after the conquest. It was a plausible academic pursuit, one that would not raise undue suspicion. He mentioned several family names, burying the name of Lady Edith of Wessex among them. For months there was no reply, and a cold dread began to grow in him that the mother and child had perished on their journey, or had disappeared so completely that no trace remained. He began to fear that Sir Aldrich's sacrifice had ultimately been in vain, a noble gesture swallowed by the unforgiving sea. Then a response arrived. It was a short, coded message from a brother, at a small, remote monastery on the western Irish coast, a place called Skellig Michael. The monk wrote that their abbot had knowledge of the Wessex line and would be willing to speak with Thomas in person, but warned that the journey was perilous and not to be undertaken lightly. The specificity of the response, singling out the Wessex name from his list, was the sign Thomas had been praying for. He secured permission for a pilgrimage, a common enough reason for a monk to travel, and used the last of his resources to book passage on a ship out of a small Welsh port, far from the watchful eyes of the Earl of Yorkshire's men at Ravenspur. The journey was arduous, but he eventually arrived at the stark, windswept rock of Skellig Michael, a pinnacle of stone rising dramatically from the Atlantic. It was a place of profound isolation, a sanctuary built as close to heaven and as far from the world of men as possible. The Irish abbot, a man named Colman, was ancient and nearly blind, but his mind was as sharp as a scribe's knife. After days of spiritual discussion, testing Thomas's sincerity and purpose, Abbot Colman finally led him to a small locked chamber. He revealed that his monastery had indeed sheltered Lady Edith and her son, who had arrived 10 years ago, brought to them by a fisherman paid by the merchant Tostig. They had lived there for many years under the assumed names of Ilara and Art, their royal lineage, a secret known only to the abbot. The abbot then produced a small locked chest containing a collection of letters. They were from Edith, written over the years to her son, intended for him to read when he came of age. They were a mother's lament, a chronicle of sorrow, loss, and a fierce, burning pride. In her elegant, sorrowful script, Edith recounted the story of her secret marriage, the birth of her son, and the terror of their flight from England. She wrote in heartbreaking detail of the sacrifice of Sir Aldric de Montclair, a man she called her unwilling saviour, the Norman knight, who had damned himself to save them. The letters were her testament, a private history to ensure her son never forgot who he was, or the price that had been paid for his life. These letters were the proof Thomas sought, a living record of the conspiracy, but they revealed something more, something that shifted the investigation once again from the past to the immediate future. The most recent letters confirmed that Edith had passed away 2 years prior from an illness. Her son, now a young man of 20, raised in the fierce independence of the Irish monasteries and educated by their scholars, was no longer a frightened boy in hiding. The abbot revealed that the boy, who now called himself by his true Saxon name Edgar, was fully aware of his heritage and the strength of his claim to the English throne. The abbot's final revelation was the most stunning. The young heir had not remained in the monastery's seclusion. A year ago, he had left Skellig Michael and travelled to the court of the High King of Ireland in Dublin. The letters showed that he had been secretly building a coalition of support, forging alliances with powerful Irish nobles and the growing number of displaced Saxon lords who had fled William's rule. He was a charismatic and intelligent young man, combining his mother's Saxon legitimacy with his father's Norman cunning. He was no longer a secret to be protected, but an active and growing threat to Norman rule. The investigation that had started with a buried sword had led Thomas not to a cold case, but to the brink of a new war. The hidden heir was hidden no longer. He was gathering an army. Brother Thomas returned to England, smuggling the copies he had made of Lady Edith's letters within the binding of a heavy theological tome. The knowledge he now possessed was incendiary. The secret heir was alive, a grown man preparing to press his claim, backed by Irish and Saxon forces. This revelation recast the entire political landscape. The threat was no longer a hypothetical possibility based on decade-old documents, but an imminent and active rebellion brewing just across the Irish Sea. Thomas felt he was standing on a precipice, holding the spark that could ignite a war that would dwarf the original Norman conquest in its scope and brutality. He believed he was the only person in England who understood the true nature of the coming storm, but he was wrong. His next step was to understand the identity of the crowned serpent, the powerful Norman baron who had fathered the heir and whose conspiracy had set all these events in motion. The abbot's confession had been deliberately vague on this point, the old man too terrified to speak the name aloud. Thomas's only clue was the pouch of Flemish coin the merchant Tostig had mentioned. He returned to the abbey archives, this time searching not for Saxon lineages, but for records of Norman lords with significant financial ties to Flanders, specifically those who held lands or titles there before the conquest of England. The search was painstaking, a needle in a haystack of trade charters and feudal oaths. After weeks of relentless work, he found a match. One name stood out: Baron Ranulph de Gace, a nobleman who possessed vast estates in both Normandy and Flanders, and who was known for his immense wealth derived from the Flemish wool trade. More damningly, Thomas found a record of a diplomatic mission Ranulph had undertaken to the court of the Saxon king Edward the Confessor years before the invasion, a mission that had placed him in Northumbria at precisely the right time to have met and secretly married Lady Edith. But there was a problem with this theory. Baron Ranulph had been a public and vocal supporter of William's claim, one of the first to pledge his ships and soldiers to the invasion. He had fought and died at William's side during the Battle of Hastings, a celebrated martyr to the Norman cause. How could he be the secret conspirator if he had died fighting for the very king his son would supplant? The answer came not from a document, but from a moment of chilling realization. Thomas remembered the crowned serpent seal, a symbol of a hidden power. He recalled the abbot's story of the cabal of conspirators who had murdered Sir Aldrich. What if the conspiracy was not the work of one man, but of many? The final devastating twist of the investigation began to unspool in his mind. He went back to Abbot Michael, not with questions, but with an accusation. He confronted his superior, not just with the name Ranulph de Gace, but with a list of other Norman lords who had financial ties to him, men who had also been part of that pre-conquest diplomatic mission. He accused them of being part of a larger secret network. Under the weight of Thomas's relentless and now knowledgeable questioning, the abbot finally broke completely. He confessed the whole truth. Sir Aldrich de Montclair had not acted alone in his decision to defy his orders. His change of heart had been prompted by contact with a secret society of Norman nobles, who were part of Baron Ranulph's original conspiracy. Ranulph's death at Hastings had been a catastrophic blow to their plans, but it had not ended them. This cabal of powerful men, including the Earl of Yorkshire, and even Abbot Michael himself in his younger days, had become disillusioned with William's brutal, tyrannical rule after the conquest. They had initially hoped to control William, or moderate his excesses, but had found him to be an intractable and bloody-minded king. Their secret goal had shifted. They no longer sought to merely install their own candidate. They sought to overthrow a tyrant who was staining the honor of the Norman people. Sir Aldrich, a man they knew to be honorable beneath his brutal reputation, had been one of their recruits. He was a member of their dissident network. His mission to eliminate the heir was in fact a cover for him to make contact with the hidden family and orchestrate their rescue, a plan devised by the entire cabal. His apparent defiance was not a lone act of conscience, but a coordinated move in a much larger plot. This revelation redeemed Sir Aldrich completely. He was not a simple soldier who had a crisis of conscience. He was a willing and courageous participant in a secret rebellion from the very beginning. The murder of the knight by his own compatriots now took on an even more tragic and sinister meaning. The abbot confessed that the group had fractured under the pressure of William's ever-tightening grip on power. The Earl of Yorkshire represented a pragmatic, ruthless faction who believed the plot had become too risky. They had decided to scuttle the plan, murder Aldrich to ensure his silence, and make their peace with William's rule in exchange for power and security. They had betrayed their own cause and their own man. The sword's placement in the well was the final, brilliant piece of their treacherous puzzle. It was not just evidence of a murder or a memorial. It was a prearranged signal, just as Thomas had once suspected, but its meaning was the opposite of what he had imagined. It was a sign to the remaining loyal conspirators scattered across England and Normandy that the plan to rescue the heir had succeeded, but that the rebellion was over. It meant, the package is delivered, but the plot is compromised. Stand down, abandon the cause. The pristine sword buried beneath stones was a symbol of a rebellion put to sleep, a promise buried but not forgotten. Thomas now understood that several powerful Norman lords currently serving King William were in fact secret supporters of the heir in Ireland, silent traitors waiting for a signal that the time was right to rise again. The sword he had helped unearth was that signal. Brother Thomas stood in the cold stone scriptorium, the collected evidence of his 10-year-old investigation, spread across the oak table like a map to civil war. He possessed copies of Lady Edith's letters, a testament to a mother's love and a son's birthright. He had his own testimony, drawn from a fearful merchant and a guilt-ridden abbot, which chronicled the heroic sacrifice of Sir Aldric de Montclair. He held the knowledge of a hidden heir in Ireland, a young man actively gathering an army, and the even more dangerous secret of a network of powerful Norman lords, sleepers, who were waiting for the opportune moment to betray King William and support the boy's claim. He held in his hands the power to delegitimize the Norman conquest, to expose the king as a usurper, and to plunge England into a war that would make the harrowing of the North seem like a brief skirmish. The truth, in its entirety, was his alone, and the weight of it was crushing his soul. He faced an impossible choice, a crucible of conscience that Sir Aldric himself must have faced. The first path was one of self-preservation. He could heed the abbot's warning, take every piece of vellum and parchment, and commit it all to the flames. He could destroy the truth, allowing the lie that had held the kingdom together for a decade to stand. This would save his own life, and perhaps the lives of thousands who would perish in the coming conflict. But it would be the ultimate betrayal of the knight who had died to protect that very truth. The secret would die with him, and the Earl of Yorkshire and the other murderers would continue to enjoy their power, their crimes forever concealed. It was the path of silence and survival. The second path was that of Sir Aldric. He could take the evidence, the undeniable proof of the heir's legitimacy, and hide it once more. He could create a new cache, a new secret for a future generation to uncover, trusting in Providence that a time would come when the truth could be revealed without igniting a war. This path honored the secret, but delayed justice. It was an act of faith in the future, a hope that the seeds of truth could lie dormant without rotting away, but it offered no resolution for the present, leaving the young heir in Ireland to fight his battle without the powerful weapon of legitimacy that only these documents could provide. It was the path of patience and hope. The third path was that of the martyr. He could reveal everything he knew. He could send a message to the heir in Ireland, dispatch riders to the secret Norman conspirators, and present his findings to the highest ecclesiastical authorities in the land, perhaps even to the Pope himself. This would be an act of absolute conviction, a declaration that truth and justice were worth any price. It would almost certainly restore what many would see as the rightful king to the English throne. But it would unleash the dogs of war upon a land that had already bled too much. It would also, without any doubt, mean his own death. The Earl of Yorkshire would ensure the monk who exposed him would not live to see the dawn of a new reign. It was the path of sacrifice and chaos. As he stood frozen between these choices, the flickering candlelight casting long dancing shadows on the stone walls, the final twist of his fate arrived not as a revelation, but as the sound of armored men and horses in the monastery courtyard below. He rushed to the narrow window of the scriptorium, peering down into the torchlit darkness. A company of Norman soldiers, their helmets and spear tips glinting in the firelight, was surrounding the abbey. They were not the local garrison from Thornwick. Their banners were those of the Earl of Yorkshire. They moved with a grim, silent efficiency that spoke not of an arrest, but of an execution. The Earl had discovered his investigation. Perhaps the abbot's nerve had broken, or Tostig the merchant had talked, or perhaps one of his own letters to Ireland had been intercepted. The reason no longer mattered. His time for deliberation was over. The choice had been taken from him. The Earl's men were here to eliminate him, and seize the evidence he possessed, to permanently silence the ghost of Sir Aldric de Montclair. The soldiers were already forcing the main doors of the abbey, their shouts echoing up from the nave. He was trapped. With only moments to act, Brother Thomas looked at the damning proof on his table. His life was already forfeit. The only choice that remained was what to do with the truth that had cost him everything. Would he destroy it, ensuring the Earl's victory and erasing Sir Aldric's sacrifice forever? Or would he find a way in his final moments to ensure the truth survived him, making his own death a weapon? As the heavy booted footsteps of the Earl's men began to thunder up the stone staircase toward the scriptorium, Brother Thomas, the monk who had only wanted to live a life of quiet contemplation, had to make a final decision, knowing that the future of a kingdom rested on what he did in the next few seconds before the door splintered inward.